Hello everyone, in this tutorial we're gonna build a REST API in Go using the Gin framework. We will build an event app where user can register, log in. We will also have all the CRUD operation for event, so a user can create, read, update and delete the event. A user can also attend the event, and we have endpoints to see what users are attending a specific event, or we can see what events a user is attending. And we can also remove attendees from an event. For the authentication, we will use JWT token. We will also have authorizations for some endpoints. So for example, only the owner of an event can delete that event. You will also learn how to build this API documentation page using Swagger. It will list all your API endpoints, as you can see here. And you can also see for the endpoints what parameters they take and what response they will give. And then you can call the API from here. So if you press try it out and then execute here, we will get back a list of all the events stored in the database. Let's get started on building this. To enable live reload when making changes to the files, we're going to use a tool called Air. I have already installed it on my system, but if you go to their GitHub page, you can see instructions on how to install it. Now if we go here, and then there will be instruction here how to install it. If you are using CSH as your terminal, you might have to add this so you can run the Air command. After that, we're going to have to create the air.toml file. This code will be available in my blog post and also in the GitHub repo, so you can just copy this and paste it in. Let's open up our code editor. Create a new file, .air.toml, and then I will just paste it here. This file is generated by running air init command, air init. Since I already have the file here, I don't need to run it. And the only changes I have done is I have updated the paths here so it will match our project structure. The next step is we can now initialize a new Go module. In your terminal, you can write go mod init REST API in Gin. So here is an overview of the database tables we're going to create. We will have a users table that's going to have an ID column, email, name, and password. We will also have the events table. That one also have ID, owner ID, name, description, date, and location. To be able to let user attend events, we will need an attendees table. And this will have an ID, and then the user ID that's attending the event, and then also the event ID, which event is the user attending. After that, we can create our project structure. So we will create a CMD folder, and inside the CMD folder we will have two apps, one called API, and inside here we can create a main.go, and then we will have a migrate folder. That will also have a main.go file. And inside the migrate folder, we will have a folder called migrations. Then we will create a folder called internal. In the internal folder, we will put code that we can share between our applications. So for example, our database models, maybe I would like to share it between this app and this app. So inside this folder, create a folder called database and create another called env. Next, we will start working with our migrations. So inside the main.go file in the migrate folder, open this up. In case you haven't worked with migrations before, you can see it as a version history for your database. So every time you make a changes to the database, maybe you add a table, you change a column, and so on. There will also be a table that keep track of the changes that has been done. In case something bad happened, you can go back to how the database was before that change. So the package will be main, and then we will create a main function, func main. Inside this one, we will write if len of the OS args is less than 2. Then we will log and exit the program. Log fatal, please provide a migration direction up or down. So every time we run the migrations, we're going to tell if we want to apply a new migration or we want to go back to a previous one. So the first argument in os.args is the name of the program. If the length is less than 2, that means we didn't provide argument up or down. Let's create a new variable. So direction, and we set that to be os.args, and the second element. After that, we're going to open a connection to our database. So we can say db error and set that to be SQL open. For the first argument, we're going to be using SQLite. So we say SQLite tree. And the second argument will be the path to our database. So we can say ./data.db. We will check if there is an error. If error not equal to nil, then we will do a log.fatal error. After that, we will say defer db.close, and this will make sure we close the db connection once we are done with running the file. And to handle migration, we're going to use a library called Golang migrate. So we can create 2 more variables, instance error, and here we will say SQLite tree with instance db, and we can pass a empty SQLite tree config. If we go to the top of our file, we can see that the new package has been added here. Now we just need to install it. So to do that, we can press quick fix and we can press here go get package, and it will now be installed. You could also open up a terminal and write go get package and this package name. Here we will check for an error. If error not equal to nil, in that case we will do log.fatal error. After that, we're going to specify where we store the migrations file. We will do that by creating an instance of the file struct. This also comes from the Golang migrate library. We can create 2 more variables. So f source and then say error. And then here we will use the file struct. So file.file. And after we initialize it, we can call open. So open, and then we will say cmd migrations. And here we will check if there is an error. If error not equal to nil, we will do a log.fatal. After that, we can actually run the migration files. So let's create 2 more variables. Call the first one m, second one error. And then we will say migrate new with instance. And here we will say file. And we pass our f source variable, f. And then we will say SQLite tree, and we pass the instance to it. Looks like I forgot to set a colon here. And then again, we can check if there's an error. If error not equal to nil, we do a log.fatal. After that, we will add a switch statement. So we'll say switch, and we will check the direction. In case it's up, we will create a if statement here. So if, and then we create a variable m.up, and here we will say if error not equal to nil and error not equal to migrate.error no change. In that case, we can do log.fatal error, and up should be a capital letter, so up like that. And then we can do the same for down. So we can copy this, and then we will paste like this. And instead of up, we're going to say down, and we will call down here. And we also want to add a default case. So in case the direction is not up or down, that means we pass the invalid direction. So we will print that. Log.fatal invalid direction. Use up or down. And in case you wonder why we have to write all this code, doesn't Golang migrate already have a CLI that you can use? And that is true, but at least when I made this video, they didn't support SQLite, so you had to write some custom code to make it work. Now we can create our migration files. To do that, let's open up a new terminal. migrate, create ext, we say SQL, and for the directory, we say ./cmd migrate migrations, and then we will say seq, and that will basically create a number for every migration we create, and then we will say the name, so we can say create users table. And it created two files, up and down. So in the up file, we will create our users table, and in the down file, we will revert the changes. Let's also do the same for the events and the attendees. So here we can say events and attendees. And if we now open our file tree, we should see here that in the migration folder, there will be a bunch of new files. Let's now add the SQL code to create these tables. So we can start with the users. Make sure you open up the file that says up, and we will say create table if not exist users. Then we will have an ID. There will be a integer, primary key, auto increment. Email, text, not null, and it will be unique. So two users cannot have the same email. Name, text, not null. Password, text, not null. Let's continue with the events migration. So here we can say create table if not exist events. It will have an ID. There will be integer, primary key, auto increment, and it will have an owner ID. That will be an integer, not null. The name of the event, that will be text, not null. Description, text, not null. Date, there will be a date time, not null. Location, that will be text, not null. And then at the end we will say foreign, key, owner, ID, references, users, ID, on, delete, cascade. Here we are saying that every event will have an owner ID that's connected to the users. And the reason we have this owner column is because later we can use it to restrict some operations, for example, update and delete. So only the owner of the event can do those. The on, delete, cascade, it means that if the user that owns this event is deleted, then the event will also be deleted. Next, let's do the attendees. So attendees, I'm going to say create table if not exist attendees. You say ID, integer, primary key, auto increment. And it will have a user ID. There will be a integer, not null, event ID, integer, not null. And here we will say foreign key, user ID, references, users ID, on, delete, cascade. And then we can copy this and paste it in here. And then we will change user ID to event ID, and then users, events. I think I missed to add a semicolon to the other migrations, so let's do that. So for the users, we will add a semicolon here, and then for the events, we will add one here. So we have created now all the migrations for running the up commands, and now we just have to add the down commands. Let's start with the user. So all we need to do is revert that table. So drop table if exist users, and we can do the same for the other migration files, events. And then we can say events here. And then for the attendees, we will say attendees. We can now open up a terminal and run these migrations. Let's clear this. So we will say go run and then the path to the migration script we wrote before. So cmd migrate main.go up. And because we didn't see any error in the terminal, that means it was successful. And we can also look here in the file tree. Data.db has been created. And if you have a program to view SQLite database, you can also verify that those table has been created. So let's do that. I will be using Table Plus. So Table Plus, and I open that one. Click the plus here and select SQLite. And then I am in the directory for this project, and I will select data.db. I will press connect. And if we look here, we have one attendance table, one table for the events, and then we also have a table for the migrations that keep track on what migration has been run. And we have a table for the users. And then there is also a SQLite sequence table that is an internal table for the SQLite. So the next thing we want to do is connect our API app to the database. So let's do that now. Let's open VS Code. And we can open up the main.go file in the API folder. And then we will say package.main, and it will have a main function. Here we say db error, and then set that to be sql.open SQLite tree, and then the file path to our database ./data.db. And if there is an error, we will say log.fatal error, and then let's close the database connection when we are done. So defer db.close. And we are now going to create our models. So inside the internal folder, go to the database and then create a file called models.go. Inside this one, we will say package database, and we will say type models. There will be a struct, and it will hold users. There will be a user model, events, there will be an event model, and then attendees, attendee model. And then we will say func new models, and it will take a DB connection. So DB, and that will be of the SQL.db type, and it will return our models. So here we will say return models. And we will pass the DB connection for every models. We can say users, user model, DB, DB. Then we do the same for events, event model, DB, DB. Then also attendees, attendees, attendee model, DB, DB. Now we just have to create those models. Let's start with the user model. Let's create a new file and call it users.go. Package database. And then we can say type user model via struct. That will take the DB connection, or DB SQL.db. And then we will also create a user struct. So we say type user struct. This will have all the columns that we had in the database. ID, there will be an int, and then we will add JSON tags. So these JSON tags, they are used to define how a struct is converted to and from JSON. So here we can say JSON ID. So when we convert a user struct into JSON, the ID here will be converted to lowercase. And if we have a JSON and want to convert it to a user struct, it will be converted to have a ID with the uppercase I. So let's move on with the other fields. Then we have email. There will be a string, JSON, email. Name, string, JSON, name. Password, string, JSON. And then we will put a hyphen here. So this means when we convert a user struct to JSON, the password field will be removed. And this is so we will not leak any sensitive information when we're sending the response to the client. Now we can create a model for our events. So we'll create a new file in the database folder. Now we call it events.json. user.go, and it belongs to the database package, and we will say type event model struct, same as the user model, so db of type sql.db, and then we will create our event struct, so type event struct. We'll have an ID, there will be an int, we'll say JSON ID, this should be lowercase, and then we will have owner ID, it will be an int, JSON owner ID, and then we will add a new tag called binding, and we will set that to be required. So the binding tag will be used by the Gin framework when we receive a request with the data and we want to bind the data to this struct. Later we will update this, so instead of we passing it with the response, we will check who's the logged in user is and set the owner ID that way. And then we have name, string, JSON, name, binding, and it will be required, and we will say min equals 3. So this means that when Gin is gonna try to bind the name, if the length is less than 3, it will throw an error. And looks like I missed some double quotes, should be here. And we have description, there will be a string, JSON, description, and we will say binding, required, and we will set a minimum length of 10. If you want, you can also add like maximum length. That would probably be a good idea, but I'm gonna skip that for now. Then we have the date, and we can set that to be a string, and then JSON, date, and we'll say binding, required, and we will say date, time, and then say 2006 0102. So this means when binding the date, it needs to have a proper date format. And we say location, string, JSON, location, binding, we say required, and min to be 3. So now we only have one model left to create, and that is the attendee model. So let's do that. Create a new file in the database package and call it attendees.go. And then we will say package, database, type, attendee model, struct, takes a db, and that will be of type sql.db. And then we will say type, attendee struct, and we will say id, int, JSON ID, and then we have user ID, int, JSON, user ID, and then event ID, int, JSON, event ID. So if we now open up our models file, we can see now all the errors are gone. The next thing we're gonna do is set up the Gin server. We can start by creating a new file called routes.go in the API folder. Routes.go. Close the other files for now. And this one will belong to the main package. Here we will create a new method, so func, and this will belong to a struct called application. And we will call it routes. And this will return a HTTP handler. And then inside here we will create a new variable, so g, and set that to be Gin default. And then we will return G. And we also have to install the Gin package. And this should be a capital letter. Gin default will set up some logging and recovery that come with the Gin library. And later we're gonna add all the routes in this file. Now we can create a new file called server.go. So in the API folder, create a new file, server.go. And here we will say package main, and we will create a new method, so func serve, and this will also belong to the application struct, and we're gonna create that one later. And this one can return an error. What we're gonna do here is to create our HTTP server. So we'll say server, and we set that to be http.server. And then we will set the address, and we can use the fmt sprintf. Here we can say %d. And then we should pass the port that we are running from. And we will get the port from the application struct. So we can say app.port. And for the handler, we will call the routes file that we created earlier. So app.routes. And then you can also add some configuration, like for the timeout. So idle timeout, let's say time.minute. And then we can set read timeout, maybe 10 times time second. For the write timeout, maybe 30 times time second. And then we can add a log statement. So log printf starting server on port, and then we say %d, and we pass the port app.port. As the last step, we will say return server, and then we will call listen and serve. So we have our routes, and we also have our server. To help us work with environment variables, we will create a helper file. So in the env folder, create a new file called env.go. We set the package to be env, and then we will have a function called get env string. This will take a key and a default value string, and it will return a string. So what we're gonna do here is to check if the key exists in the environment variable. In that case, we just return it. Otherwise, we will return the default value. So if value exists, and then we set that to be OS, lookup env, we pass our key, and then we say semicolon exist. So if it exists, we can return the value, return value. Otherwise, we're just gonna return the default value. And then we will create a similar one to handle integers. We can copy this function. And then we can update the name of this one. And we will call it get env int. And instead of it returning a string, it will return an int. And before we can return it, we need to convert it into an int. So we can say if int value and then error. We set that to be strconv, and then we use the auth method, say value. So if the error equals nil, in that case, it means it's safe to return the value. So return int value, and the default value here should be a int. And then we have to set key here to be string. For the serve function, it seems like I did a mistake. It shouldn't be a function. It should actually be a method that belongs to the application struct. So let's fix this. Like this. We can now create our application struct and start the server. So let's open up main.go. Let's create our application struct. You say type application struct. And then we can say port. That will be an int. We will have a JWT secret string, and that will be used later for the authentications. And then we will have our models. So with models, database.models. With the application struct, we can pass dependencies around without having global variables. Let's initialize our models. So we can say models, and that will be database, new models, and then we pass the DB. We will create a new application struct. So app, we set that to be application. And then we have to pass the port. And here we will use the helper functions that we created earlier. So env, get env int. We will say port. And as a default value, we say 8080. Then JWT secret, env, get env string. So the key will be JWT secret. And for the default value, we can just say some secret 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. and then we have to pass our models. So we can now start our server by saying if, and then we create a variable error, and we set that to be the return value from app.serve. If error is not equal to nil, we will just exit the program and log it. So log fatal error. And before we start the server, let's create the env file. So in the root of the project, we can say .env port, and we set that to be 8080, and then JWT secret, and that will be, let's just set it to some random value. Because env variables can contain sensitive data, it's always best practice to add them to a git ignore file. So let's do that. In the root of the directory, we will say .git ignore, and then we can say .env. And to be able to read the env file, we have to use another package. So we can say underscore. To load the env file, we will use the go.env package. And then we have to install it. So when we start the program, this will automatically load an env file that it finds and make those values accessible in the program. Because we are using the SQLite tree here, we also have to add the import for that. I forgot to do that earlier. So let's say underscore. We can now try to start our API and see if it works. So open a new terminal, and then you can say air. And we got a print out starting server on port 8080. That means everything is working. Currently, we don't have any routes for our API. Let's add all the CRUD functionality for the events. If we go to our routes file, so what we can do now is start by creating a new group. So we will say v1 and set that to be g group. Then we will say API/v1. All the routes that we add to this group will have that path prefix. It's always a good practice to version your API. In case you change how a handler works, you can just create a new handler and call it v2 instead. You won't break the API for people using your v1 version. And then we can create 2 brackets here. You don't really need to add those, but it makes it easier to read the code. So here we can say v1, and we will say post/events. And this will be the route for creating an event. So then we can say app create event v1 get/events. And then we will say app get all events v1, and we will do a get again. And then we will say /events and then /:id. So this will be the route for getting a specific event, and you have to pass the ID. We say app get event. Then we will say v1.put, and it will be /events/id. And this will be for updating an event. It's very common when you're updating something that you use the put HTTP method app, and then we say update event. And then our last one will be for deleting an event. So v1 delete/events, and we will also pass an ID for that one too. Say app delete event. Now we are going to create our handler, or as some people say, controllers. They will be responsible for receiving the request and responding. So in the API folders, we can create a new file, and we will call it events.go. It will belong to the package main. And let's start with the handler for creating an event. So func, and this will belong to the application. We will call it create event, and it will have a context. We can call it C, so gin.context. And then we will say var event database event. We have our empty event struct, and this is the one we created before. Now we want to use the Gin framework to bind the incoming request to the event struct. We can write if, and then we declare a variable error and set that to be C. And then Gin has a method called should bind JSON, and then we will pass the pointer to the event. We'll say event, and this one can return an error. So we say error not equal to nil. So in that case, we want to send back response. We can do c.json, and if we could not bind it, that means there's something wrong with the request. So we will say HTTP status bad request, and then we can say gin.h, and gin.h is basically just a shortcut for a map. Here we can write the key. We will say error, and then for the value we will say error.error. If we cannot bind the data to the struct, we will return status 400 with the error provided. If there is no error, that means we were successful to binding the data to the struct, and then we can try to insert it to the database. We will create a new variable, error, and we will set that to be app.models.events, and then insert. We then pass our event. And here we will check if error not equal to nil. In that case, we can say c.json, and here we can say HTTP status internal server error. So that will be a status 500. And then we can gin.h error. Here we can say failed to create event, and then we want to return here to cancel the execution. And if there is no error, we can just say c.json HTTP status created. So that will be a status 201, and then we can just return the event. There should also be a return statement here. So this method we will create later, but first let's create all the handlers for the events. And also, if you remembered, when we created the event struct and we set up the binding tags, so Gin here will do the validation when trying to bind the data. In case some rules fail, then there will be an error here, and we will return that to the user. The next one we can create is get event. So we say func, then application get event gin.context. And we will get the ID from the params. So to get the ID, we can say ID and then error. And we set that to be strconv. And then we use the auth method. And we will say c.param ID. We read the ID from the params, and then we try to convert it into a int. We can then check if there is an error. So if error not equal to nil. In that case, we can say c.json http status bad request gin.h error invalid event ID. After that, we want to get the event from the database. So we can say event error and then app.models.events, and then we will say get, and we will pass the ID. If the event is nil, and that means we found no event with that ID in the database. So we can say if event equals nil, c.json, and here we can say http status not found. That will be a 404, and then we can say gin.h, and we say error event not found. Then we also want to check the error. So if there's an error, if error not equal to nil, then we will say c.json http status internal server error. And we can then say gin.h error failed to retrieve event. If everything went okay, we can respond with c.json, and we will say http status okay, and then we just return the event. The next handler we're gonna take a look at is update event. So func application, and then update event. We add the gin context. And this one will also take an ID as a param. So we can say ID error, and then we will convert it to a int, same as we did before. So c param ID, and then we check for an error. If error not equal to nil, then we can just do c.json http status bad request, and then we just say gin.h error invalid event ID. And then we want to get the event from the database. So we can say existing event error. We set that to be app.models events, and then get, and we pass the ID. If error not equal to nil, in that case, you can say c.json http status internal server error gin.h error failed to retrieve event. We can return here, return, and also here, return. And then we want to check if the existing event is nil. So existing event equal nil. If that's the case, we want to say c.json http status not found. We can say gin.h error event not found. And then we can create a new empty event struct. So we will say updated event. We set that to be database.event. What we want to do now is to bind the request data to the event struct. You can say if, and then we'll create a variable error, set that to be c should bind JSON, and we pass the updated event. We then want to say if error not equal to nil. In that case, we will just say c.json http status bad request, and then we can just pass the error. So error, then we say error.error. We can return here. We don't want Gin to bind the ID to the struct. So what we want to do here is to take the ID from the params. So we can say updated event.id, and we set that to be ID. And then we can say if, and we add a variable error, and we set that to be app.models events update, and then we pass the updated event, and then we check if error not equal to nil. In that case, we can just say c.json http status internal server error gin.h, and then error failed to update event. And we can just return here and then say c.json http status okay, and then we send the updated event to the user. So we have two handlers left to make all the CRUD operation work for the events. Get all events and delete events. So let's implement get all events. And we can scroll up here, and we can put it here on row 29. So func app application get all events. We pass the context, and then here we can say events, and then error. We say app.models events get all, and then we can say if error not equal to nil, then we will say c.json http status internal server error gin.h, and then error failed to retrieve events. And if everything is okay, we can say c.json http status okay, and then we send back the events. All right, so let's implement the delete event handler. We can scroll down to the end of the file and do it here. We'll say func delete event, and here we will read the ID from the param, so ID error, and we will convert it to an int, and then we get it from the param c param ID. If error not equal to nil, in that case we will say c.json http status bad request. We can then say gin.h error invalid event ID. And we can try to delete the event. So we say if, and we create a new variable, error app.models events delete. We pass the ID, and then we check if error not equal to nil. And we will then say c.json http status internal server error. We can then say gin h error failed to delete event. And if no error and we was able to delete the event successful, we can say c.json and maybe respond with http status no content. So that is status code 204. So that means everything went okay, but we're sending back no content. So here we can say nil. And now we want to implement all the database methods that we call in the handlers. So we can open up the events in the database folder. Let's start with the insert method. So we can say func, and it will belong to the event model. Insert, and as an argument, we will send in the event struct, event, and it can return an error. And we will start by creating a context with a timeout. So we can say ctx, cancel, and that will be context with timeout. And we say context background and 3 times second. And then when we are done with that, we will call defer cancel. So we can now create our query, and that will be insert into events, and it will have owner ID, name, description, date, location, and then we will say values, and we will add 5 placeholders. So $1, 2, 3, and 5. And then we want to execute our query, so we can return M, and the event model have access to the DB connection, so we can say DB. And then we want to call query row context. We will pass our context, query, and then all our data. So event.ownerID, event.name, description, date, and location. After an event is inserted, we want to update the ID, so we can pass a pointer to the ID. So we say event.id. And this should be a capital letter, like this, insert. The next method we can implement is getting all the events from the database. So func, and it belongs to the event model, get all. We will then return a slice of pointers of events, and then also an error. And same as before, we will create our context. So we can say ctx, cancel, and then we say context with timeout, and we say context background, and we will say 3 times second, defer cancel, and we create our query that will be select star, so all the columns from events, and then we will get our rows. So we say rows error, and we will call m.db.query context. We pass the ctx, and we pass our query, and we will check if there is an error. So if error not equal to nil, in that case, return no events and return the error. And then we can also defer rows.close. Then we want to create our slice of events. So events. And what we want to do now is iterate of the rows. And we want to append our event slice with event structs. So we can say for rows.next. We create an empty event, a var event, and say error and set that to be rows.gan. And here we will pass event ID, owner ID, name, description, date, and location. And then you can check for any error. So if error not equal to nil, return no events and return the error. In case there is no error, we can append our event to the event slice. So we say events equal append, pass our events here, and then the pointer to the event. And we can now go outside the loop, and then we want to do a last error check. So if error, and we set that to be rows error, and we check if error not equal to nil, then we just return nil and error. Else, if everything went okay, we can return the events and we return nil as error. Let's add a method to retrieve a single event. So func event model get ID int, and it can return event and error. And same here, we will use context, so ctx cancel context with timeout and context background, and then 3 times second. So before we use the query context, and that is for when you have multiple rows, because now we will be working with a single row, so we will use query row context instead. We will say defer, cancel, and then we can create a query. It will be select star from events, and then we'll say where ID equals placeholder. And we then want to execute our query. This should be uppercase. So we can say error, and we set that to be m.db query row context. We pass our context, query, and ID. And here we will create our empty event struct. So we can now use scan to update the event. Event.id, event owner ID, event name, description, date, and location. This should be capital letters. And then we can check if there was any error. So if error not equal to nil, when using the query row context, and if it finds no rows to return, like for example you pass an ID that does not exist in the database, it's gonna return an error, and we want to catch that error. So what we can do is if error equal SQL error no rows, in that case we just want to return nil as the event and nil as the error. Otherwise we will return nil as event and return the error. And then if everything went alright, I'm gonna return the pointer to the event and then nil as an error. And looks like I made a mistake here. It should be capital letter get, so it get exported. And also get all should be capital letter. And then we have the update method, func belong to the event model, say update, and we'll take an event as an argument, and it can return an error. And same as before, we want to use the context, so I can just copy this one. And then we will create our query, and there will be update, events, set, name, and there will be a placeholder, and we will do the same for all the other columns we want to update. So description, date, location, and then I will say where ID and set that to be placeholder 5. And as you maybe see, I skipped the owner ID column, because once you created an event, then you are the owner of the event and cannot change that. And then we want to execute the query. We don't care about the result coming back, so we can say underscore error and set that to be mdb exec context. We pass the context, query, event name, event description, event, date, location, and then we will pass the event ID. We check for if error not equal to nil, return error, and if everything went okay, we just return nil as the error. And the last method we have left is the delete method. Let's just copy this. Here we will say delete, and as an argument we will pass an ID. It will be an int, and in the query we can say delete from events where ID is equal to placeholder. The only thing we want to pass here is the ID. Same here, we will check for if there is an error. In other case, just return nil. And to be able to connect events with attendees and also have events have an owner, we need to create a user. So let's do that now. But first, let's fix the misspelling here. It should be delete. And it looks like we have some error in the events file in the API. So let's see what that is. Insert, that should be with a capital I. All right. Now the error seems to be gone. So let's go to our routes file. And here we can create a new route for creating a user. So we'll say v1 post and then auth/register. And then we will have a handler app.register user. In the API, let's create a file called auth.go. And it will belong to the package.main. And for now we can close the other files. And we will start by creating a struct called register request struct. And then inside here we can say email, string, JSON, email. And then we say binding required, and it's supposed to be an email. And then we can say password, string, JSON, password, and binding required, and minimum length is 8. And then for the name will be a string. We set that to be JSON, name, and then binding required, min equal 2. And looks like I misspelled here, and no space here. So let's create the handler. So we say func, it belongs to the application, and we say register user. It will take the context. So var register, and we set the register request, and then we can try to bind it to the request. So we say if, and then we create the variable, and we set that to be c.should bind JSON. We pass a pointer to the register request, and if error not equal to nil, in that case you say c.json http status bad request, and we say gin.h error, and we can say error, and then we return from here. And if we was successful to binding the request to the register request, we don't want to store the password in plain text, so we're gonna hash it. We say hashed password, set it to be an error, and then we're gonna use the bcrypt library. So we will say bcrypt, and then generate from password. So we will convert the password to a byte slice. So we say byte, and then register password, and then we're gonna set the cost. So basically how many times we're gonna try to run the hash. The bigger number is gonna make it more secure, but it's gonna make it also slower. We will use the default cost from bcrypt default cost, and then we can check if there's an error. If error not equal to nil, in that case we will just say c.json http status internal server error, and then gin.h error, something went wrong. We return from here. Then we can update the password to be the hash one. So we can say register password, and we convert it to a string. So we say string hashed password, and then we will create a new user. So we say user, and we set that to be database user, and we say email register.email password register.password name register.name. And we can now try to insert the user to the database. So we say error and set that to be app.models users, and then insert, and we pass a pointer to our user. We check for error, so if error not equal to nil, we will respond with c.json http internal server error gin.h, and we say error. Then we can say could not create user, and we will return from here else everything is good. So we say c.json, and we say http status created, and then we just return the user. And if you remember, on the user struct, on the password, we set JSON to be underscore. So now when we return the users to the client, the password is going to be excluded from the response. And now we have to update our user model and add an insert method. So go to the database folder, open the user file, and then we say func m, it belongs to the user model, insert user, and it can return an error. And here we will create the context like we did in the other method. So we say ctx cancel, set that to be context with timeout, and then context background, and then we set 3 time second, and then we call defer cancel, and we can now create our query. So we say query insert into users email password name, and we say values placeholder 1, 2, and 3, and we return ID, and then we can say return mdb. We call query row context, pass the context query user.email user password and user name. Then we will update the ID, so we can say scan and then a pointer to the ID user ID. And this looks like there's an error in this file, so let's fix it. And again, I forgot to use the capital letter. It should be insert like that. And we are now ready to test this out, so we can open up a terminal, and we're gonna use a command line tool called curl, and curl lets you send a request to test an API. I already prepared all the commands that we will use. They will be available in the source code, and you can also copy them straight from my blog. So let's copy the first one to create a user. So we'll create a user with the email testexample.com, password is password, and name is test user. And we can see we got back the user, and we got back HTTP status 201. And if we open up our database program, so I open up Table Plus and I go to users, I can now see that the user is saved here, and we can also see that the password has been hashed. So what we want to do now is to create an event with the owner ID of the user we created. So we can say here, create a new event, and we copy this, and we set the owner ID to 1 because our user have the ID 1. Let's try it out. And we get the status back 500. So that means I have done something wrong. Let's try to figure it out. And I think when creating an event, maybe we can, let's just print the error and see if we can see something. Print error. And let's try to run it again. Got the error. And we get back there are no rows in the results set. That's interesting. Let's go back to the events, create events. Let's see here in the model what could be wrong. I think I forgot to return the ID. Let's see if that is the reason. So returning ID, and let's try again. Yeah, okay, so that was the problem. We have now managed to insert our event. All right, we have one user and we have created one event. Let's run the command for reading all the events. Can clear this. And then we have it here, retrieve all events. We will copy this. And we can see here we get back a list containing our event that we created. Let's also try to update the event. Copy this one. So here we change the location to New York instead of San Francisco. And we get back a 404 because I supplied the wrong ID. Let's try that again. Instead of 1, should be 4. We copy this, paste it, and then we get back 200. And it says New York here. And let's also check the database. And we can now see the location is New York. Let's also try to retrieve a single event. So here, retrieve single event. And let's see here, we change that to 4, copy it, and then we get back 200 and we can see the event also. And the last thing we can do is to delete the event. Change this to be 4 and copy it. We get back 204, so it was successful, but return no content. If we now try to get the event again, we should get a 404. And we can see here, we get 404. And if we now check our database, it should be deleted. And we have no more events. So we can register a user and we have all the CRUD operations for the events. The next step we want to do is we want to be able to connect events with attendees. And we need to go to our routes file and we will add 2 more routes. v1 post, and we will say events ID attendees and then user ID. We say app add attendee to event. And then we want to have a route where we can see all the attendees for a specific event, v1, get. Then we say events, ID, and then attendees. App, get, attendees for event. So let's start adding our handlers. So in the events file, scroll down here. Create a new method, belongs to the application, add attendee to event, and it takes context. Here we will get 2 parameters, one for the event ID and one for the user ID. So let's say event ID and then an error. We will convert it to an int, see the param ID. We check for an error, if error not equal to nil. In that case, respond with C, JSON, HTTP, status, bad request, and we can say Gin, H, error, invalid user ID, and then we just return. And then we can copy this because we want to do the same for the user ID. Here we will say user ID, and this should be invalid event ID. So what we want to do is we want to get that event from the database. We say event, error, and then set it to be app.models, events. We use the get method and we pass the event ID. We can copy this. Instead of bad request, we want to say internal server error, and we can just say fail to retrieve event. After that, we want to check if the event exists, so we can do event equal to nil. We will send back c.json http status not found. Error event not found. And after that, we want to get the user we want to add. So we say user to add, and then we say error, set that to be app.models users get, pass the user ID. And then we can copy this and we can say fail to retrieve user, and then we can copy this and we say if user to add equal nil, then we will return status not found, and we will say user not found. And we want to do one more check before we add the user to the event, and we want to make sure that the user is not already an attendee of that event. So let's copy this, and here we will say existing attendee. And then we can say app models attendees get by event and attendee. So we pass the event ID and we pass the user ID. Here we can update the message to be fail to retrieve attendee. And then we will say existing attendee not equal to nil. We can return status conflict, and that is status 409. And as the error, we can say attendee already exists, and we will return here. So if we got this far, that means we can insert the attendee to the database. So we say attendee database.attendee event ID will be event.id, user ID will be user to add .id, and then we can insert it underscore error, and then app.models attendees insert, and we pass the pointer to our attendee, and then we can copy this, and we will say if error not equal to nil, failed to add attendee, and it should just be equal here. And then finally, if we come this far, that means everything was successful, and we can say c.json http status created, and we can return the attendee. Now let's also add the handler for getting all the attendees for an event. So func get attendees for event, and we will take a context id error, and we will convert the id to an int, so c param id, and we will check if error not equal to nil. We can copy this, and then we will just say invalid event id. So here we can say users error, and we will say app.models attendees, and then get attendees by event. We pass the ID, and we can copy this. Also, we will update the status here to be status bad request, and here we can say failed to retrieve attendees for events. If everything okay, we can say c.json http status okay, and then we return the users. The next step is to update our models with the new methods. So if we go to the database folder, and then we open up the attendees file, and we can create the insert method func, and this belongs to the attendee model insert, and it will take a pointer to attendee, and then we create the context ctx cancel, set that to be context with timeout context background, and then we say 3 times second defer cancel, and then we will create our queries. We say query insert into attendees, we will pass event ID, user ID, then we say values, placeholder 1 and placeholder 2, and we will return the ID. Then we can execute the query. The error, and we set that to be mdb query row context has the context query attendee event ID and attendee user ID, and then we call scan and pass the attendee ID, and then we check if there's an error. If error not equal to nil, in that case return nil and error, and we have to add the return types here, so pointer to attendee and error. And if everything went okay, just return attendee and nil as error. Next, we're going to implement get by event and attendee. So we say func, and it belongs to the attendee model, get by event and attendee, event ID, user ID, and both of them will be int. And then for the return type, pointer to attendee and error. And then we can copy these lines, paste it here, create a query, set that to be select star from attendees where event ID equals placeholder 1 and user ID equal placeholder 2. Then we say var attendee, we'll create our error variable, And then we say m.db query row context. We pass the context, query, and then our event ID, user ID, and we add scan on the attendee.id, attendee.user ID, attendee event ID. Then we can check if error not equal to nil, and then we also want to check if error equals SQL error no rows. If that is the case, we just return nil and nil. Otherwise, we return nil and error. And if everything is okay, we return the attendee and nil as error. And now we also have to add the get attendees by event. Let's copy this attendee model, and then we say get attendees by event, and it should be capital letter, and it will take a event ID, that's an int, and it will return the slice of user and error. Then we copy this, say query. This query will be quite long, so I will write it on multiple rows. So we say select, and we can say u.id, u.name, and u.email. Then we will say from users, and we assign it to u. And then we're gonna join two tables. So we will say join attendees, and we will call it A, and we will say on user ID equal to attendee.user ID. And then we will say where attendee.event ID is equal to placeholder. We will get all the attendees that have the specific event ID, and then we will join attendees and users. So by doing this, we will have access to the user information like name and email. And then we can say rows error, and we set that to be m.db query context, pass the context, query, and event ID. And here we will check if error not equal to nil. In that case, return nil and the error. And then we can say defer rows.close. And then we will create a slice users. And then we say for rows.next. And we create a new user struct, so var user. And then here we can say error and set that to be rows.scan user ID, user name, and user email. After that, we check if error not equal to nil, we return nil and error. Otherwise, we can append to the user, so users equal append users and user. And then we can just return users and nil as error. So we can now add attendees to an event and retrieve attendees for an event. And before we try them out, I would like to add two more endpoints. One endpoint to delete an attendee from an event, and also an endpoint to retrieve all the events for a user. So open the routes file, and then here we can say v1 delete is events ID attendees, and then user ID. We say app.delete attendee from event. And then we will say v1.get /attendees/id and then /events. And then we will say app.get events by attendee. So let's open our events.go handler. Before we implement those handlers, let's just fix a small mistake. Here it should be capital I, like that. We can say now func app application. The method will be called delete attendee from event, and it take the Gin context. And let's see, copy this line from here. And we can copy this one more time. Here we say user ID, and here user ID, invalid user ID. And then we can say error, and we set that to be app.models attendees delete. We will pass user ID, event ID, and then we can copy this. We change this to be status internal server error. And then we can say failed to delete attendee. And if we come so far, everything okay. So we can say c.json http status no content and then nil as an error. And then let's implement the handler for getting events by attendee. So then we can say func app application get events by attendee, and it takes the Gin context, and we can copy this one and put it here. And then we will say invalid attendee ID. Then we will get the events. So app models events get by attendee and then ID. Then we can copy this. And here we can say failed to get events. And if we got the events, we can say c.json http status okay and then the events. Now we need to add our database methods. So open the attendees files. So func and belongs to the attendee model, delete user ID, event ID, and those are ints, and we return an error. Let's copy this, paste here, and then we create the query, set that to be delete from attendees where user ID equal placeholder 1 and event ID equal placeholder 2. And then we can say underscore error, and we set that to be m.db exec context. We pass the context query user ID event ID, and we check if error not equal to nil. In that case, return the error. Otherwise, we can just return nil. So let's now create the get by attendee method. Copy this, and we'll call it get by attendee, and it will take a attendee ID, set that to be int, and then we will return a slice event, and we will say query select e.id e.owner ID e.name description date location, and we will say from events, and we set that to be e. Then we're gonna join attendees, we set that to be a on e.id equal to a.event ID, where a.user ID equal to placeholder 1. We create our rows here, so rows error, and we set that to be m.db query context. We pass the context query and attendee ID. We can delete this, and if error not equal to nil, in that case return nil and error. Then we call defer row dot close, and we will create our slice of events, so var events event, and then we will loop over the rows, so for rows dot next, and we create our event error rows scan, and we say event ID event owner ID event dot name description date location, and if error not equal to nil, in that case return nil and error, else we can append it to the events, so events, set that to be equal to append events event, and then we can just return it here, so return events and nil. Actually, let's rename this one to make it a bit more clear, so get events by attendee, and then here in the events we will update get events by attendee, and this should be attendees like this. And I just realized I forgot to add one method to get a user by its ID, so let's add that method now. if we open up the users model, and then we say func user model, and then get, it will take an ID, and it can return a user and an error. Let's copy this. And then we say query, and we set that to be select star from users where ID is placeholder, and we create the user error, and we set that to be m.db query row context, the context query, and then we say scan user ID, user email, user name, and user password. And then we can check for error if error not equal to nil. In that case, if error equal to SQL error no rows, we will return nil and nil, as we will return nil and error. And if everything is good, we return the user and nil as error. And I just noticed I did a small mistake here. So here it shouldn't be with a capital letter, it should be like this, ID. And then we also have to pass the ID to the query row context, so ID. And we're now ready to test this out. So let's open a terminal, and then I will open the text file with all the curl commands. So we can start by adding a new event. Let's copy this one. So we created a new event that has the ID 7. Let's now try to add a user to that event. And we already have a user with the ID of 1. So if we go here, add attendee to event, and here for the event we can say 7, and then for the user here will be 1. So let's try that out. We paste that in. We can now see we get 201 back. So we should now have a connection between the event and the user. Let's check the database to confirm that. So now we have our attendees table, and then if we refresh it, we will see here we have one row with the event ID 7 and the user ID 1. What we can do next is to get all the attendees for an event. So get attendees for an event, and then we just change this to be event ID 7, and we copy this, we paste it, and we can see we get back the user that is attending this event. Now currently we don't have any restriction of who can create, update or delete events. It would be nice if we could restrict this to only allow authenticated users to do that. So the next step will be to add authentication. So let's open up our routes file, go here to routes, and then we can add a new route here, and we say v1 post auth login, and we can say app.login. And then we will open up the auth.go file in the API. And we will start by creating two new structs. So we'll say type login request struct. And then we can say email via string. And we will say JSON email. And then we say binding required. And it has to have an email format. And then we will say password string JSON password, and we say binding required, and we say min length to be 8. And then we will have one struct for the response. We will say type login response struct, and here we will say token string JSON token. We can now create our login handler. Well, let's do that here. Func app application. We say login, and we will take the context. So Gin context. And then we will say var auth login request, and we will try to bind the request data to the struct. So we can copy this part and we paste it here, and then we just change from register to auth. I also see that I misspelled it. Let's fix that. And then we will see if the user exists or not. So we will do existing user error, and then we can get the users. So we say app.models users get by email, And we can pass the email here, so auth.email. And then we can check if the existing user is equal to nil. So if existing user equal to nil, in that case we can just say c.json http status unauthorized. And then we can say gin.h error invalid email or password. And this should be capital letter like this. And then we can also handle the error. So you can say if error not equal to nil. In that case, you can copy this. And then we will say status internal server error. Something went wrong. And let's also return from here. And the next thing we want to do is we want to compare the submitted password with the password stored in the database. So we can say error and set that to be bcrypt, compare hash and password. We will convert the password to a slice of bytes. So we can say byte, and then we take the existing user and the password. So this is the hashed one, and then the password that the user tried to log in with. And we will say auth.password. And then we can copy this one. And we will check for an error if error not equal to nil. So if they enter the wrong password, and when we're using the compare hash and password, we will get an error. So here we can just say invalid email or password. And next what we want to do is create our token that we're going to send back to the user. Say token JWT, and then we want to use new with claims. So first we will specify the sign method. So we can say JWT sign method 256. It should be HS256. And then we will create a content of the token. So we can say JWT map claims, and it will contain a user ID. So user ID, and we set that to be existing user ID. And then we can also tell when it expires. So we say expire time.now, add time.hour times 72, and then we say Unix. And then we have to install the JWT package. So if we go up here and we can see this import, we can press quick fix and then go get package. So we have our token now. What we want to do is convert it to a string. So you can say token string and then error. We set that to be token signed string. We will pass a byte slice, a byte, and here we will pass our JWT secret that we created before in the application struct. So app JWT secret, and this secret will also be later used when we're trying to read the token to see if a user is authenticated or not. And then we can check for the error. If error not equal to nil, then we can say c.json http status internal server gin.h error generating token. Then we return here. Otherwise it means everything went okay, and we can say c.json. We will send at 200, so http status okay, and then we will say login response, and we pass the token string. So the next thing we're gonna do is to add the get by email method. So let's go to the user model. So here we have the user model, and what we can do now is we modify this get method and we will call it get user, and then here we will say query string, and we say args interface. So this means we can pass as many arguments as we want, and this query we can copy here, and we will create a new method and say func m user model, and then get id int, and it will return a user and the error. So what we can do here is paste the query, and then we say return m.get, this can be lowercase, m.get user, and we pass the query and the ID. And here it should actually be return like that. Instead of passing the ID here, it should be args. Oh, and here it should be ID int. And should be capital letter like that. So because we use the args like this, that means, for example, if we wanted to say like select from users where ID is equal to placeholder or email is equal to something, then we could just pass the email here, and we could pass as many arguments as we want. And now we can create our get by email method very easy. We take this and we just copy it and we say get by email and then select star from users where email equals placeholder. We change this to be email, string, and then email. Capital letter like that. And I might have done some mistakes in the auth.go because it's have a red color. So let's check it out. Yeah, so it seems that I didn't write it with a capital letter. So this will be like a private method, and this will make it like a public method. And same here for password. Let's see now, and also for ID. All right, seems like everything is fixed now. The next thing we want to do is we want to create a middleware, and this middleware will be used for the routes that we want to be protected. So let's go here to the file tree, and in the API folders, we can create a file called middleware.go. Middleware.go. And this will belong to the package main. Let's close the other files. And this will belong to the application struct. So app, application, and then we say auth, middleware, and it will return a handler function. So we can say gin, handler func. And then inside here we can return a function. So we say return func, and we set gin context. And here we want to read the token from the authorization header. So we can say auth header, and we use the context here. So C and then get header, and the header is called authorization. And here we can add a check. So if auth header is equal to an empty string, then we want to say c.json, and we say HTTP status unauthorized, and we can say here gin.h error. We can copy this. So authorization header is required, and then we will say c.abort. So if there is any more middleware or handler in the chain, it will cancel this, and then we can just return here. Next, we can extract a token from the header. So let's say token string, and we set that to be strings.trim prefix. Then we pass the auth header, and we're gonna say bearer. So we remove the bearer part. So all we will have left is the token. Then we want to check if token string equal to auth header. In that case, it means that the user did not send a valid token. It should always be prefixed with bearer. Let's copy this and paste it here. And then we can just say bearer token is required. We also want to abort and return. So what we want to do now is we want to parse the token and read its content. Here we say token and then error. We will set that to be JWT parse. Then we pass our token string, and parse except the function as a second argument. So we say func, and then here token, JWT token. And for the return type, we can just say interface and error. And inside this function, we just want to check if the token can be parsed. And if there is no errors, we will return the JWT secret. So here we can say if, and then underscore, okay. And we set that to be token.method. And here we will say JWT signing method signing, and this is the one we want to use. And if it's not okay, we can return nil, and then we can just say JWT error signature invalid. Else, that means everything is okay, so we can just return. Then we will have a byte slice, so byte app.jwt secret, and for the error we just say nil, and there should be a dot here. So if the method used for the token is this one, that means everything is okay. If it's not equal to that, something is wrong, then we say error signature invalid. So after this now, we want to check if error not equal to nil or token is not valid. In that case, let's copy this. Here we can just say invalid token. And then we want to check if the token is of the type claims. So claims, okay. And then we will say token.claims. And here we say JWT map claims. So the claims, it can be stored in different structure. So here we just want to check that it is of the map claims. And then we will say if not okay, we can copy these 3 lines. And then we will also say invalid token. So if we open up our auth file again, so here we can see when we created the token, we are using JWT map claims. And that's what we check here, that is of that structure. And if it wasn't clear enough for this one, so inside the token, it will have what method it used to sign the token. But someone can try to change that to be something else. That's why we want to check that the signing method for the token is the correct one and hasn't been changed. And then we want to get the user ID. So we will say user ID and set that to be claims user ID. And this will be a float 64. And you might be wondering, why is it a float 64 when we stored it as an int? That's because when it gets serialized in JSON, ints get converted to float 64. And what we can do now is to get the user from the database. User, then error. We set that to be app.models, users, and then get. And we convert the user ID to an int. So we say int user ID. And here we will check for an error. So if error not equal to nil, can copy this. And here we will say unauthorized access. And now in our context, we want to set the users. So we can say c.set user and then user. So when we set the user in the context like this, the user will be available in all our handlers. And to say that we are finished in this middleware and you just want to continue the chain to the next handler or middleware, we can say c.next. We can now add this middleware to the routes that we want to protect. So let's go to our routes files. And what we're going to do here is to create a new route group. And it will be based on the v1 group. So what we can do is we create a new variable. So auth group, and we set that to be v1 group. And we don't want to change the path, so we can just write slash. And then we can type auth group use, and then our middleware, so app.auth middleware. So all the routes that we will be adding to this group will be protected by the auth middleware. And then we can open the brackets just to make it more clear. And then we can move the routes from here to here for the one we want to protect. So this one. And also when creating an event. And this one we also want to. And then the last one is this. So then we just need to change this from v1 to auth group. And we can now try it out. So let's open a terminal. And then we can open our file with our curl command. So I will copy this to create a new event. And we can now see that authorization header is required, and we get HTTP status 401. And we can now try to log in as a user. So here we have the curl command to log in a user. I will copy this and paste it. So make sure you enter the email for your user and the password. So if I log in here, I will get a token back. And then let's copy this token. And then we can paste it here for now. So to use the token, we need to add an authorization header to the request when creating an event. So on this line, we can write H and then authorization. And then we will say bearer. We can take this token and paste it like that. So let's now see what happens when we run this command. And we can now see that a new event is created. What if we try to create a new event, but we change this token? For example, we delete here and we put another letter. Then we copy it and paste. And then we will get back the error invalid token. So the next thing we want to add is authorization. That means that, for example, only the owner of an event can delete that event and not another user. Same with like updating event. Only the owner should be able to do that. So we will create a new file here in the API directory. And we will call it context.go. And then we say package main. And this will be like a utils method that will help us extract the user from the context that we set earlier in the middleware. And we can say func application and then get user from context. It will take the Gin context. And it will return a pointer to a user. So database.user context user and then exist. And we say c get user. If it doesn't exist, we want to return an empty user. So we can say return database.user. And then we will say user. Okay. And we will check the pointer to the user. So we can say context user database user. And if something is wrong, we can say if not okay, return empty user. And as the last step, we just return the user. So let's now update our handlers. We can open up the events file in the API folder. And let's start with update event. So here we can say user, and we can then call app get user from context. And here we pass the context. And then here we can just add a check if existing event dot owner ID, that if it's not equal to the user.id, that means you're not allowed to update this event. So we can copy this, and there should also be a return statement here. And then let's paste this and add a return statement here. And then for the status code, that will be status forbidden, and that is 403. And then we can update the error message to say you are not authorized to update this event. And then let's also do the same for delete. We copy this and we go to the delete, and let's get the user from the context. So user app get user from context. We pass the context, and let's also get the event we want to delete, existing event, and we set that to be app.models events get, and we pass the ID. We also have to create an error variable, and then we can copy this one, and here we can say status internal server error, and then fail to retrieve event. Let's also check so the event exists. If existing event equals to nil, in that case we can say status not found. And then we can say event not found. We should return here and here. And now we just need to do the check that we did before. So actually, let's copy that, update this check here. If the existing event owner ID is not equal to the user ID, then we can say you are not authorized to delete this event. Now let's do the same when we add an attendee to an event. So here, add attendee to event. So we can do the check here. We will say user and then get it from the context app, get user from context, and then we paste the code that we used before, but we called it event instead here. And then we can say you are not authorized to add an attendee. And we also want to do the same when deleting an attendee from an event. So here, delete attendee from event. And first we can check if the event actually exists. App, models, events, get, then we pass the ID. Actually, let's copy this line. And if it fails, we can say something went wrong. And if event equals nil, in that case, we want to say status not found. And here we can say event not found. Remove this. And then we get the user. So user app, get user from context. And if event dot owner ID not equal to user dot ID c.json http status internal server error and then gin.h error. Let's copy this message. And let me paste it here. You are not authorized to delete an attendee from event. And I also see that I misspelled this one, so let's update it real quick. And then just update here in the routes. Okay, so the only one we have left now is for the create event. And this one will be a bit different. When we're creating the event, we don't want to use the user ID to restrict. Instead, we want to set the owner ID to be the user ID instead of having to pass it with the request. After we have binded the data to the struct, what we can do is a user and then app, get user from context, and then we just say event.owner ID and we set that to be user.id. And then we also have to update our event struct. If we go to the events in the database folder and we go up here to the struct, and here we will just remove binding required. We built the whole API with all the endpoints, and the only thing we have left now is to add Swagger. So let's close all the files. And then we can open up main.go. We can start by importing the docs. So after we generated the docs, they will live in a separate folder in our project. So to import them, we can just say our package name, so REST API in Gin, and then docs. And then above the application struct, we will start adding some comments. So the way Swagger works is that you add comments to your code, and then basically you will run a command, and the Swagger package will look at all those comments, and based on the comments, it will generate the documentation. So here we can say title, go Gin REST API, and then we can say version 1.0. And the easiest way is just to look at the Swagger documentation and see what tags they support. And we can also add a description, REST API in Go using Gin framework. And then we will say security definitions dot API key bearer auth. So here we're saying what authentication method are allowed, and we're using the bearer auth token. And then we can say in header. And here we're saying that we expect the authentication token to be present in the header. And the header's name will be authorization. And we can also give it like a description. Enter your bearer token in the format. So basically when the users see the input in Swagger where they're gonna enter the bearer token, and then we have to open up our routes file, so routes, and we will add some new import. We say Swagger files, and it will be github.com swaggo/files, and then Gin Swagger github.com swaggo Gin Swagger. And what we need to do now is we have to add a route that will serve our Swagger documentation. Or we can do that at the bottom. So here we say g.get, and then we will say swagger/.any, and we will pass a function here. So func, and it takes the context, gin context, and then we will check if c.request URI is equal to Swagger. Then we want to do a redirect, so we can say c.redirect 302 for the status code, and then we just say swagger/index.html. So by doing this, we don't have to write the path like this. When we visit the documentation, we can just say /swagger. And then we want to use the Gin Swagger, and we will say wrap handler Swagger files handler. So this handler will serve our Swagger frontend. And then we also have to say where the documentation is stored. We can say Gin swagger.url, and here we will say http localhost 8080/swagger doc JSON, and then we will call this and pass the context like this. Now we have to install our dependencies. So we will do go get package swaggo files, and then we will also get the Gin Swagger. So what we can do next is to document one of our handlers. So if we open up events.go in the API folder, and then we can, for example, do the get all events. Here I will say get events, return all events, and then summary returns all events. And we can have the same for description, return all events, and then we can say tags, and that's basically how they will be structured on the site. So they will say events, and we can say accept, that will be JSON, and it produce JSON, and if there is a success, it will return 200, and the type it will return will be object, and that will be the list of database event. And for the path, we can say router API/v1/events, and it will be a GET request. We can now open up a terminal and try to generate our docs. I had some problems with the dependencies, not sure why, but let's run go install swaggo swag like that. And then we can run the command to generate the Swagger documentation. So we'll say swag init dir cmd API parse dependency parse internal parse dept1, and all those flags are basically just so it can find our dependencies. For example, when we specify a response type, and then here we say the directory our application lives in. So let's run it. I misspelled it, so it should be parse dependency. Let's try it again. And we can now see that it has generated our Swagger documentation. And if we open the file tree, we can also see here we have a docs folder, and we can now go to our browser and visit the Swagger documentation page. I'm not sure that Air will actually pick up those changes, so we might have to restart it. Let's kill it, Command C, and then we start it up again with Air. Let's go to our browser, and then we can say localhost 8080 Swagger. And we can then see that we get to our Swagger page, and here is the handler that we documented, and we can see the response type here, and we can also try it out. So let's do that, try it out, execute, and then we get back all the events in our database. And here we also have the authorize button. And since basically all the handlers, it will look very similar, they will have the exact same tags, just some different value. I'm not going to type all of them out, but there will be a link to the source code where you just can copy the code, and also a link to my blog. But if we would visit it, you could see here would be all the endpoints. So then you can just say copy, and we open up our editor again, and we paste it in the events. And then we do the same for, here is the auth file. We open auth.go, we paste it here, and then we can just generate the docs again. We go back to our browser, and if we refresh now, it will have all the other endpoints. And to log in a user, you can press here, login, try it out. And then for the email, I will say test example. That's the user I have in the database. And then the password, and I press execute. And you can see in the response, I get a token back. And to add this to every request, you go up here and you press authorize. And then you will say bearer, and then paste the token and press authorize. So every time now you execute one of those requests, the token will be sent with them. So this is the end of this tutorial, and we have completed the project. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe and like the video. And the source code will be available in the description, and there will also be a link to the article on my blog. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next video.